They said when the God Emperor wakes, humanity would be saved. They lied. I watched him rise from that golden throne, and in that moment I knew the truth. We should have let him sleep. Because what crawled out of that 10,000-year tomb wasn't our savior. 'Twas our executioner. If you want to know what happens when a god decides humanity deserves extinction, hit that subscribe button, because this story gets darker than you can possibly imagine. My name is Captain Malcador Vane of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, the 10,000 who never sleep, never falter, never question. For 4 centuries I stood at the southeast position of the Golden Throne, my guardian spear planted on obsidian floors worn smooth by countless feet. 400 years of watching a corpse that refused to die. The inner sanctum was a cathedral of golden machinery and endless candles, their light dancing across walls inscribed with the names of the fallen. The air always smelled of incense and ozone, thick with the prayers of 10 billion souls begging for salvation. Tech priests scuttled like insects around their sacred machines, their augmented limbs clicking and whirring. Sisters of silence stood like statues, their presence creating dead zones in the warp. And in the center of it all, him. A withered husk strapped to a throne of gold and adamantium, kept alive by technologies we no longer understood, and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. This was my reality. This was my purpose. Until the day everything ended. It started with a tremor. Subtle. The kind only someone attuned to the throne's rhythms would notice. The tech priest dismissed it, just another structural shift in ancient mechanisms. But I knew better. The palace was my second skin. This was different. The air grew heavy, charged with invisible electricity. My armor began to hum, resonating with something I couldn't identify. Shield Captain Valoris glanced at me, the barest movement of his golden helm. In 10,000 years, no custodian had ever broken position without direct threat. Then came the pressure. It built inside my skull like a vice closing. My enhanced physiology screamed warnings. Around me, tech priests began moving faster, their movements frantic. The Sisters of Silence started convulsing, blood seeping from beneath their helms, and then, light. Not from the machines, not from the candles. From him. A golden radiance erupted from that withered corpse, intensifying until it outshone everything. Tech priests cried out in terror and ecstasy, their red robes pooling as they prostrated themselves. The Sisters of Silence collapsed, their null abilities useless against this tsunami of psychic force. I felt my consciousness being crushed. Through sheer will alone, I remained standing while others died around me. My twin hearts hammered against my ribs. Blood vessels burst in my eyes. Through the blinding light, I watched skeletal fingers, motionless for 10 millennia, slowly curl. Ancient bones creaked like breaking branches. His head began to rise, the entire chamber shuddered. Dust and stone fragments rained from the vaulted ceiling hundreds of meters above. Servo skulls dropped from the air, their machine spirits extinguished instantly. Then he opened his eyes. Reality tore. A psychic scream erupted outward, not through air, but through existence itself. It speared through me like frozen lightning, stopping my hearts before they thundered back to life. Around me, mortal serfs collapsed, blood pouring from every orifice, their minds simply erased. Through the chamber viewports, I witnessed impossible horror unfolding across Terra. Pillars of golden light erupted from the planet's surface, punching through the atmosphere into the void. Entire hab blocks collapsed as if struck by orbital bombardment. Vehicles fell from sky lanes like metallic rain. In orbit, ships exploded, plasma drives detonating in spectacular silent bursts. And I alone remained standing among my brothers. Perhaps proximity to him had granted me immunity. Perhaps he had purpose for me. I don't know. But I watched as my fellow custodians fell, their auramite armor clattering against stone like discarded toys. The light from his eyes was beyond comprehension. 2 newborn suns that burned cold instead of hot, illuminating not just matter but thought itself. I felt those eyes examining me, cataloging every memory, every doubt, every secret fear. And I knew, this wasn't the Emperor we'd imagined. This wasn't the benevolent father returning to save his Imperium. This was something else, something transformed by 10,000 years of unimaginable agony. 10,000 years watching his dream become a nightmare. 10,000 years existing as both corpse and god. This was wrath incarnate. His voice materialized inside my mind, not heard, but experienced. It contained multitudes, spoke with the weight of eons, conveyed meanings beyond mere words. Malcador. He used a name I'd nearly forgotten after centuries of being simply custodian. Witness what must follow. The light intensified, no longer merely radiating but actively reaching out. Tendrils of golden energy extended through the chamber and beyond, passing through solid matter like it wasn't there. I felt those tendrils spreading across Terra, across the Sol system, across the galaxy itself. Wherever they touched, they judged. I felt the deaths, billions of souls snuffed out across Terra alone. Every false saint who'd twisted his words for personal gain. Every corrupt priest of the ecclesiarchy who'd built fortunes on faith. Every devoted worshipper of the imperial cult who'd made him a god against his ancient decree. Their minds ceased to exist, erased by his merciless judgment. Across the galaxy, psychers screamed and died as his power touched them through the warp. Navigators went mad, their third eyes burning out. Astropaths fell silent mid-transmission, bodies crumbling to ash. The Astronomicon, already blindingly bright, flared with renewed purpose. No longer merely a beacon, but a weapon, scouring the warp of entities that had feasted on humanity's suffering for millennia. And still, it was only beginning. I watched his withered form begin to change. Desiccated flesh filled out, not with mortal muscle but with pure psychic energy given physical form. The countless tubes and mechanisms that had sustained his corpse began pulling free, ancient metal and plastic melting away. Tech priests wailed in horror and ecstasy as the sacred mechanisms they'd tended for millennia became obsolete in moments. He rose slowly, inexorably. His feet touched obsidian floor for the first time in 10,000 years. Where they connected, stone transformed into something that was no longer merely physical matter. Reality rippled outward from each footfall. I watched him stride forward, each step burning with purpose. His form was now pure golden light, vaguely humanoid but constantly shifting. Only his face remained recognizable, terrible in its beauty, the face that had launched 1,000 crusades, that had united humanity, that had been the last thing Horus saw before destruction. But those eyes were no longer human at all. He approached me, towered over my considerable height, the only being who'd ever made me feel small. Rise, Malcador Vane, last of my true guardians. There is work to be done. His words bypassed my ears, materializing in my consciousness with such force I nearly blacked out. I found myself standing without memory of rising from the kneeling position I had unknowingly assumed. Tell me, my son, what has become of my Imperium while I slumbered? How does one answer that? How do you summarize 10,000 years of slow decay? Of corruption? Of endless war? Of faith twisted into fanaticism? Of progress strangled by superstition? I couldn't speak, couldn't form coherent thoughts under that weight of attention. But I didn't need to. I felt his mind effortlessly sifting through my memories, extracting everything I'd witnessed, everything I'd learned from the histories. I felt his growing displeasure, a cold fury that threatened to freeze my blood. They have undone everything I created, the imperial truth abandoned, science sacrificed at altars of ignorance, humanity enslaved by the very superstition I sought to free them from. And you, my custodes, reduced to symbolic guardians of an empty throne. I wanted to protest, to defend the Imperium that had survived impossible odds, to explain the necessities that had driven us to become what we were. But in his presence, such thoughts seemed hollow. He turned away, his attention focused beyond Terra itself. I felt his consciousness expanding, touching minds across the galaxy. Some withered instantly, others transformed. In the warp, I sensed great disturbance, as if the chaos gods themselves had been confronted by a predator more terrible than they'd imagined. They named me a god, he said, words resonating through my bones. Against my explicit command, they twisted my vision into religion, blind faith and mindless obedience. They built an empire of suffering in my name. Now they shall learn what it truly means to face the judgment of a god. I knew then what was coming, not salvation, not the triumphant return the Imperium had prayed for. Extinction, the end of everything. In his eyes, humanity had failed him. The dream of the imperial truth was dead, replaced by superstition and ignorance he'd fought to overcome. Now, awakened after millennia of agony sustained only by indomitable will and daily sacrifice of thousands, what remained was not the emperor of legend. This was pure vengeance incarnate, determined to cleanse the galaxy of the corruption his beloved humanity had become. The universe trembled. The gods themselves quailed in fear, and mankind faced judgment it had unknowingly prayed for. Imalcador Vane, last faithful son of the true emperor, faced a choice no custodian should ever make: to serve my God, or save humanity from him. The inner sanctum became a tomb, bodies scattered across obsidian floors, final moments frozen in rapture or terror, blood pooled in ancient grooves worn by 10,000 years of footsteps. The air reeked of copper and burnt electrical components. Through armored viewports I watched Terra's skyline, once the most imposing vista in human civilization, partially collapse. Great sections simply fell, as if stone and adamantium had lost the will to stand. The Emperor moved through this devastation like a figure from ancient myth, golden light illuminating destruction he'd wrought merely by awakening. I followed, my body responding to unspoken command. Corridors once crowded with supplicants, tech priests, and guards were now silent save for echoes of his footsteps and my heavy armored tread. We passed chambers where high lords had debated, now filled with corpses slumped over ancient tables. We walked through chapels where the faithful had worshipped, golden aquilas and sacred icons melted into unrecognizable lumps. Wherever faith had been strongest, death was most complete. As we approached the Eternity Gate, I saw the first resistance. A line of space marines from various chapters stood with bolters raised, helmets removed, faces resolute but afraid. At their center, a figure in ornate artificer armor, imperial fists heraldry gleaming. "My lord," the captain said, voice steady despite terror I could sense, "we beseech you to halt. Something is wrong. The deaths, the destruction, this cannot be your will." I tensed, certain these noble warriors were about to be obliterated. But he paused. His radiance dimmed slightly as if focusing. "My sons, my flawed creations, you who were meant to be humanity's guardians, not its jailers. Look upon me and know your failure." Light intensified but focused. A beam of pure golden energy struck the Space Marines. I expected vaporization, genetically enhanced bodies reduced to ash. Instead, something more terrible occurred. They began to change. Armor, weapons, even flesh became translucent, revealing truth beneath. I saw corruption in their gene seed, flaws developed over 10,000 years of degraded reproduction. I saw pride that had replaced duty, blind obedience that had replaced reason. Every compromise, every failure, every moment they'd chosen dogma over truth, and they saw it too. One by one, they fell to their knees. Weapons clattered to floors. Some wept openly, faces contorted in anguish. Others simply stared, minds unable to process forced revelation. Only the captain remained standing, swaying as if struck physically. Face wet with tears, yet eyes fixed on the Emperor with devotion transcending horror. "We have failed you," he said simply, "but we have always loved you, Father." Something flickered across the Emperor's face, an emotion gone before I could name it. Love. You know nothing of love. What you feel is dependency, blind devotion of a child to a parent they cannot understand. It is not love I require from my creations. It is growth, wisdom, the courage to become more than what you were made to be. His light intensified again. This time when it struck the captain, there was no revelation, only annihilation. The proud space marine, veteran of countless battles, simply ceased to exist. Not burned, not torn apart, erased as if he'd never been. The others followed one by one, their existence snuffed with casual indifference. I stood rooted, mind struggling to process this. These were his own creations, his gene sons, however distant. They'd served him for 10,000 years, fighting and dying in his name, and he'd extinguished them without hesitation, without mercy. "You question my actions, Malcador." His attention turned to me fully, that infinite gaze boring through mental defenses like they were mist. I felt armor growing hot, skin blistering beneath, mind screaming under pressure. You wonder if this is justice, if this is what mankind prayed for during long millennia of my entombment. I didn't respond, couldn't, but thoughts betrayed me. I have seen your mind, loyal Malcador. I know you believe the Imperium, for all its flaws, all its cruelty and superstition, is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. You believe I condemn mankind to death by removing structures, however corrupt, that preserved it. He gestured. Reality folded. Suddenly we stood on a balcony high above the outer palace. The vista was apocalypse incarnate. Great swathes of Terra's endless cityscape burned or lay in rubble. The sky tore with unnatural storms, golden lightning striking from cloudless heavens. Throughout it all, I sensed deaths continuing. Billions upon billions judged and found wanting. This is not extinction, Malcador. This is transformation. His voice was softer now, almost gentle, yet still carrying absolute authority that brooked no disagreement. Mankind has spent 10,000 years destroying itself in my name. They built an empire on the bones of their brothers and sisters. They sacrificed freedom for security, truth for comfort, the future for the past. They became less than human while claiming to represent humanity's pinnacle. He turned to me, face both beautiful and terrible, a father forced to discipline beloved children. I did not create mankind to worship me. I created the Imperium to free humanity from superstition and fear, to guide them toward a future where they'd need no gods, no emperors, where each human life would be lived in light of reason and compassion. Look upon what they created instead. With a gesture, he expanded my perception. I saw through a billion eyes across Terra, hideous inequality, vast masses toiling in conditions little better than slavery, while high lords lived in unimaginable luxury. Casual cruelty, lives thrown away for trivial reasons, superstition replacing science, mindless rituals replacing understanding, an empire that preserved human life while destroying everything making that life worth living. Beyond Terra, the vision expanded further. Hive worlds where trillions lived and died without ever seeing sky. Forge worlds where human flesh fused with machine, not for enhancement but control. Death worlds where children were sacrificed to produce space marines. An Imperium devouring its own people to sustain itself. Committing atrocities beyond counting in the name of survival. This is not my Imperium, not what I fought for, not what my sons died for. This is perversion, mockery of everything I sought to build. The vision faded, but now I noticed something I'd missed. Amid destruction, there were places where golden light touched more gently. Isolated communities whose inhabitants had suddenly stopped, eyes widening as new understanding blossomed. Individuals scattered throughout devastation who now moved with purpose. Faces transformed by revelation, rather than obliterated by judgment. I am not destroying humanity, Malcador. I am saving it. Those who built lives on lies, on worship of a false god they created in my image. Those who profited from others' suffering. Who hoarded knowledge that should have been shared. Who used my name to justify their power. They cannot be part of what comes next. But those who sought truth despite lies they were fed. Who showed compassion in a system designed to crush it. Who questioned when told only to obey, they will be the seed of a new humanity. A humanity worthy of the future I envisioned. He turned inward. Attention focused on something I couldn't perceive. But first, the old order must be completely dismantled. Institutions that corrupted my vision must be broken beyond repair. False faith built in my name must be expunged from human consciousness, and those who benefited most from this corruption must face harshest judgment. I felt his attention expanding outward, beyond Terra, beyond Sol into the vast galaxy. I knew what came next. Lords of Mars with their hoarded technology. Chapter masters of the adeptus astartes with their feudal empires. Inquisitors with absolute authority and secret agendas. All who'd built power upon foundation of his absence would face his judgment, and after them a reckoning with enemies. Older and more terrible still. The chaos gods who'd corrupted his favorite son. Alien empires that had preyed on humanity during moments of weakness. Ancient evils lurking in dark corners of the galaxy. None would be spared the light of his attention. It would be the end of everything. Every power, every institution, every belief system that had defined the galaxy for 10,000 years, wiped away to Make room for something new, something that would have no place for the vast majority of humanity as it currently existed, standing beside the being I'd been created to serve. The God I had, despite my oaths, worshipped for centuries. I felt the first seed of doubt take root, a question no custodian should ever ask. Was the Emperor still worth serving? That doubt grew as we traversed ruins of what had been humanity's greatest civilization. The Emperor moved with terrible purpose, his light judging and condemning wherever it touched. I witnessed death of billions, minds erased by his passing thought. Ancient institutions crumbling, leaders judged and found wanting. The entire apparatus of imperial governance, built over 10 millennia, dismantled in hours. For most, death was instantaneous. Consciousness extinguished the moment. His light touched them. For others, the worst. Offenders, death came slowly, high. Lords who'd ruled in his name were forced to experience suffering their decisions had caused, living through every death, every moment of pain, every despair their rule had inflicted. Cardinal priests of the ecclesiarchy were made to see the true emperor they'd never known. Their faith burned away by reality of his presence before their lives. Followed inquisitors who'd committed genocide in his name, felt deaths of every innocent soul they'd condemned. It was justice of a sort, but justice without mercy, without consideration for impossible circumstances these humans had faced, without acknowledgement that most had simply been trying to preserve what they believed he'd created. We stood now in ruins of the ecclesiarchal palace, the vast cathedral complex that had been center of the imperial cult. Golden statues melted, stained glass shattered, sacred texts burned. Priests who'd tended this place were gone, bodies nowhere to be seen, as if erased from existence itself. "Why have you brought me here, my lord?" I finally found courage to ask, voice sounding thin and mortal in aftermath of such destruction. His response came not in words, but images, memories pulled from my mind and others shown with almost painful clarity. I saw birth of the imperial cult in years after his interment on the golden throne. Political calculations of those who'd encouraged it, earnest belief of those who'd spread it, comfort it provided to countless trillions living in a galaxy of horrors. I saw the Horus heresy from his perspective, betrayal of his most beloved son, corruption of half his space marine legions, near destruction of everything he'd built. I felt his pain as he was forced to destroy Horus, his grief as he was carried broken to the golden throne, and I felt the moment when his mortal body failed but his will refused to follow, trapping him in eternity of pain. Eternity of witnessing his dream twisted into nightmare. 10,000 years of agony, Malcador. 10,000 years watching everything I built perverted into its opposite. 10,000 years of being transformed from a man with vision into a god without mercy. What would such experience do to you, I wonder? What would it do to any being, no matter how powerful? For the first time since awakening, I heard something like doubt in his voice. Not doubt in rightness of his actions, but doubt in what he'd become. They made me a god, Malcador. Against my wishes, against everything I fought for. They placed me on a pedestal and worshipped the idea of me while betraying everything I actually stood for. And in doing so, they changed me. The belief of trillions is a power in itself. Their faith, their devotion, their prayers, for 10,000 years it has battered against my consciousness. For 10,000 years I have endured not just physical pain of my ruined body, but psychic pain of their misplaced worship. He turned to me, face more human than I'd seen since awakening, lined with exhaustion older than most civilizations. And now I find myself behaving as the god they made. Me judgmental, merciless, seeing humanity not as individuals worthy of compassion, but as a mass to be shaped, to be judged, to be condemned or saved according to my whim. This is what they have made of me, Malcador. This is what I have allowed myself to become. I had no words. What response could there be to such confession from such a being? But it changes nothing. The Imperium as it exists cannot be saved. It is built on foundations of lies and fear. It perpetuates suffering on a scale that would drive you mad if you could truly comprehend it. It has betrayed every principle I fought for. It must be torn down completely before anything worthwhile can be built in its place. He gestured. Reality folded again. Now we stood in orbit, looking down upon Terra from the void. The planet was transformed, great swathes of endless cityscape now in ruins, orbit filled with debris, remnants of ships and stations destroyed in first moments of his awakening. But more terrifying was what I saw happening to the warp. The immaterium, that parallel dimension of psychic energy, always a seething cauldron of madness and danger, was changing. Great currents of golden light coursed through it, burning away corruption that had defined it for millennia. Demons and entities that had called it home were fleeing before this light or being consumed by it. At the center of this transformation, his consciousness extended into the warp itself, reshaping it by sheer force of will. I felt panic of the chaos gods as their domains were invaded, as souls they'd claimed were torn from their grasp, as very laws of their reality were rewritten by power they'd thought safely contained. For the first time in 10,000 years, the ruinous powers knew fear, but it wasn't only creatures of chaos affected across the galaxy. Every being with even slightest psychic sensitivity felt his presence. Most human psychers had died in first moments of his awakening, minds too fragile to withstand his unshielded power. Now I sensed death spreading, touching races that had never worshipped him, never known of his existence. The Eldari, those few who'd survived birth of Slaanesh, screamed as their souls were judged by a god not their own. The orcs, whose crude energy had created its own gods, found those deities suddenly contested by power beyond their comprehension. Even the tyrannid hive mind, that vast alien consciousness consuming countless worlds, recoiled from golden light, spreading through the warp. This wasn't salvation. This wasn't even vengeance. This was extinction on a galactic scale. "My lord," I said, voice steady despite horror growing within me. "Is this truly your will? The death of all sentient life?" He turned, expression unreadable, eyes burning with light threatening to overwhelm my enhanced vision. "Not death, Malkador. Transformation. Those worthy will survive. Those who can adapt to a universe without God save one, without the crutch of faith, without comfort of comfortable lies. They will be the foundation of what comes after." "And how many will that be, my lord? How many out of the trillions who now live?" Silence. Long silence. His attention seemingly focused on restructuring of reality happening around us. "Fewer than you would wish, Malkador. More than you might fear. But numbers are irrelevant. It is quality that matters now, not quantity. Humanity has bred itself into trillions, but at what cost to the individual human soul? Better a billion free humans than a trillion slaves to superstition and fear." I thought of the Imperium I had known, of countless lives spent to maintain it, of sacrifices made, horrors endured, all to preserve a system that, for all its flaws, had kept humanity alive in a galaxy, determined to exterminate it. I thought of faith that had sustained ordinary humans through lives of unimaginable hardship. I thought of courage shown by mortals who had none of my enhancements, none of my advantages, yet still stood against darkness, and I made my decision. "My lord," I said, words leaving my mouth before I'd fully formed the thought. "I cannot allow this to continue. Treason of the highest order, heresy beyond imagining." Yet I knew them to be right the moment they were spoken. His attention turned to me fully, that golden gaze focusing with intensity, threatening to unmake me where I stood. I felt armor growing hot, skin blistering beneath, mind screaming under pressure of his regard. "You would stand against me, Malkador? You who were created to serve me? You who have witnessed corruption of everything I built? You would defend this mockery they have made of my Imperium? Despite pain, despite certainty of my own destruction, I stood firm. I would defend humanity, my lord. The humanity that exists, not the humanity you wish existed. The humanity that has survived 10,000 years of horror, through faith and sacrifice and courage. The humanity that, for all its flaws, still contains potential for everything you once hoped it might become." Pressure intensified. I felt blood vessels bursting in my eyes, in my brain. I tasted copper as my enhanced body struggled to repair damage faster than it was being inflicted. My armor, designed to withstand the most extreme environments in the galaxy, was beginning to melt, yet still I stood. "They are not worthy of your defense, Malkador. They have squandered every gift I gave them. They have built an empire of suffering on ruins of my dream. They worshipped me as a god while betraying everything I stood for." I met his gaze, though it felt like staring into twin suns. "They are human, my lord, imperfect, frightened, limited in their understanding, but they have survived. They have endured horrors you cannot imagine while you slumbered. They deserve better than extermination at the hands of the being they've spent 10 millennia praying for. For an instant, something flickered across his face. Doubt? Recognition? I couldn't say, but pressure eased. Just slightly. And what would you have me do instead, my faithful Malcador? Return to the Golden Throne? Resume my endless vigil while the Imperium continues its slow decay? Accept worship of trillions while watching them destroy themselves in my name? I had no answer. What alternative could I offer to a being of such power, such knowledge? What compromise could there be between his vision of humanity's potential and the flawed reality of what humanity had become? Then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Not mine, but his, shared with me in that moment of connection. The Emperor as he'd been during the Great Crusade. Standing before a vast window of his flagship, looking out at a newly compliant world, a human world brought back into the fold not through conquest but through diplomacy, through reason, through shared vision of a better future. I felt his pride in that moment, his hope for what humanity might become, and I felt something else. Something I hadn't expected to find in the being who'd just condemned billions to death, love genuine, love for the species he'd dedicated, his existence to guiding, protecting, elevating. My lord, I said slowly, struggling against pain still radiating through my body. You once believed in humanity's potential to grow beyond its flaws. You once had patience for their slow evolution toward the beings you knew they could become. Has that changed? Or have you simply lost the compassion that tempered your judgment? Pressure increased again. I felt myself being lifted off the ground, armor creaking as unseen forces threatened to crush me. Compassion, he thundered, the word reverberating through the warp itself. I have watched for 10,000 years as they murdered each other in my name, as they burned those who sought knowledge, as they tortured those who questioned their dogmas, as they sacrificed their own children to appease a God that was never listening. And you speak to me of compassion? Despite agony, despite certainty of death, I persisted. Yes, my lord. Compassion. The quality you once valued above all others. The quality that separated you from tyrants who came before you. The quality that made your Imperium worth fighting for. He held me suspended for what seemed eternity, his mind probing mine, searching for deception, for weakness, for the flaw that would justify my destruction. All the while, his power continued spreading across the galaxy, judging, condemning, remaking. Finally, he set me down. Pressure eased, though it didn't disappear entirely. My armor was ruined. Once golden auramite blackened and warped by heat no physical weapon could generate. Skin beneath was burned, though enhanced healing had already begun repair. You truly believe they are worth saving, Malcador? This Imperium that has betrayed everything I created it to be? These humans who worship me as a god while ignoring everything I taught them? I stood straight despite pain, meeting his gaze as directly as I could. I believe that among the trillions you would condemn, there are those who embody everything you once valued in humanity. Courage, compassion, the will to improve themselves and their world. They are the minority. Yes, they have always been the minority, but they exist, and they deserve the chance to build something better from ruins of what has failed. Long silence. His attention seemingly divided between our conversation and restructuring of reality, continuing around us. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Pressure of his presence slightly diminished. And what would you have me do, Malcador? What alternative do you offer to my judgment? I considered carefully, knowing fate of trillions hung on my response. Guide them, my lord. Not as a god dealing death from above, but as you once did, as a leader. Show them the path to the future you envisioned. Correct their errors, yes. Punish those who have most egregiously abused your name, yes. But give humanity the chance to learn, to grow, to become worthy of the potential you once saw in them. His expression was unreadable, his thoughts beyond my comprehension. Around us, transformation of the warp continued, though it seemed to have slowed slightly, as if he were diverting some portion of his attention to our conversation. You ask me to be patient with a species that has had 10,000 years to learn from its mistakes and has instead only compounded them. You ask me to guide those who have proven themselves incapable of following the most basic principles I established. Yes, my lord, because that is who you were, not a god of judgment, but a teacher, a father, one who understood that growth requires time, Requires mistakes, requires forgiveness. He turned away, gaze directed outward toward the galaxy exposed before him. I felt his consciousness touching distant stars, distant minds, weighing and measuring worth of civilizations risen and fallen during his long absence. Perhaps, he said finally, there is wisdom in your words, Malkador. Perhaps my judgment has been hasty, colored by 10,000 years of pain and witnessing perversion of my work. Perhaps there is another way. I felt sudden shift in the warp, a redirection of golden energy that had been remaking it. Not cessation, but change in purpose. Where before it had been weapon of judgment, now it seemed to be searching, examining, evaluating with greater care. I will not return to the Golden Throne. That prison has held me too long, nor will I allow continuation of the imperial cult, the perversion of science into religion, the transformation of my imperium into theocratic nightmare. These things end now. But the destruction, the judgment, these I will reconsider. There may be more worth preserving than I first believed. Relief flooded through me, so intense I feared I might collapse despite my enhanced physiology. He had listened. The being who could remake reality with a thought had considered words of his creation and found merit in them. Thank you, my lord, I said simply, knowing no more elaborate response was necessary or appropriate. Do not thank me yet, Malkador. His voice carried warning now. What comes next will still be the end of the Imperium as it has existed for millennia. The corrupt will still face judgment. Institutions built on lies will still be dismantled. False faith created in my name will still be expunged. But it will be done with discernment, with recognition that not all who participated in this system were equally culpable. He turned back to me, expression now that of a general planning a campaign, focused and determined. And you, my faithful, doubting Malkador, you who had courage to question a god, you will be my instrument in what comes next. My voice among those who cannot withstand my direct presence, my ambassador to the humanity I once knew and may come to know again. Before I could respond, reality shifted once more. Void of space disappeared, replaced by ruined grandeur of the imperial palace. We stood in a chamber I recognized, though it had been transformed by his presence. The Senatorum Imperialis, where high lords of Terra had once governed the Imperium in his name. The massive table where they'd sat was untouched, but thrones arranged around it were empty, their former occupants now judged and found wanting. Here is where we begin the Reformation, the first of many conversations that will determine the shape of what comes next. You have earned your place in this, Malkador. Your voice will be heard. As I took my seat, I felt weight of what had just occurred. I, a custodian created to serve without question, had questioned the Emperor himself, and lived to tell of it. More than that, I had affected his judgment. Had turned his wrath, if not to mercy, then at least to more measured consideration. It was heresy beyond imagining. It was also, perhaps, the most faithful service I had ever rendered. What comes next will not be easy. Malkador, he said, reading my thoughts with casual ease. The galaxy has grown used to its corruption, its compromises, its comfortable lies. Removing these will cause pain, resistance, even open rebellion. There will be war unlike any seen since the Horus Heresy. There will be suffering on a scale that would break a lesser being to witness. But there will also be hope, a chance for humanity to become what it was always meant to be, free from shackles of blind faith, free from predation of chaos and Xenos alike, free to grow into its psychic potential without the corruption that has always accompanied it. He leaned forward, eyes now burning with determination rather than judgment. This is the task before us, Malkador. Not the destruction of humanity, but its rebirth. Are you prepared for what that entails? I thought of the Imperium I had known, of its cruelties and its kindnesses, of the trillions of lives that would be affected by what was to come, of institutions, beliefs, the very foundations of human civilization that would be torn away, leaving countless souls adrift in a galaxy suddenly transformed. I also thought of the potential that had always existed within humanity, the capacity for greatness the Emperor had recognized and sought to nurture, the future he had envisioned where mankind would evolve beyond its primitive roots to become something truly transcendent, a future that might now, against all odds, still be possible. I am ready, my lord, I said, voice steady with newfound purpose. For humanity. For the future. For the Imperium that may yet be. He nodded, satisfied with my answer. And in that moment, as his attention turned to reshaping of human destiny, I understood the true answer to the question that had started this entire journey. What happens when the Emperor finally wakes? Everything changes. The galaxy trembles. The gods themselves quail in fear, and mankind faces not the end but a new beginning. Whether that beginning leads to extinction or transcendence remains to be seen. But I, Malcador Vane, last faithful son of the true Emperor, will be there to witness it, and perhaps in some small way to guide it. The work began immediately. There was no ceremony, no declaration, no formal announcement of the Emperor's return. Such things were unnecessary when his presence was felt in the mind of every psychically sensitive being in the galaxy. Instead, there was purpose, direction, the reshaping of a civilization that had spent 10,000 years slowly decaying. The Emperor's judgments continued, but with precision of a surgeon's scalpel, rather than indiscriminate destruction of his initial awakening. The highest echelons of imperial power were first to face his scrutiny, those who'd abused their authority, who'd twisted his vision to serve their own ends, who'd profited from others' suffering. These were removed without mercy, not erased from existence as before, but punished in ways that fit their crimes. Their minds rewritten to understand the full weight of their transgressions. Others, those who genuinely sought to serve humanity despite corruption of the system they inhabited, were spared. Some were even elevated, their minds expanded by his touch, their understanding deepened to comprehend true scope of what was to come. I watched as he remade Terra, the cradle of humanity transformed once again into beacon of what mankind could achieve. Endless hive cities with their billions living in squalor and ignorance were not destroyed but renovated, open to light and air. For the first time in millennia, factories that had belched poison into atmosphere for 10,000 years were reconsecrated, their machine spirits replaced with technology that had been kept hidden in vaults of Mars, and Mars itself, the red planet, trembled at his return. Population of tech priests divided between those who welcomed the chance to rediscover true spirit of innovation buried beneath millennia of ritual, and those who clung desperately to religious trappings that had defined the mechanicum for so long. The latter were judged harshly, their hoarded knowledge extracted before their consciousnesses were extinguished. The former were transformed, their augmented bodies enhanced beyond wildest dreams, their minds freed from doctrines that had constrained them, technologies that had been locked away, deemed too dangerous or too sacred for common use, were now examined with fresh eyes. Some were indeed too volatile, too corrupted by chaos or entities of the void to be safely employed. These were destroyed utterly, but others, technologies that could have eased suffering of trillions, that could have advanced humanity's development by millennia, these were brought forth and distributed. Within months, the Sol system was transformed. Ships that had once taken years to travel between stars now made the journey in weeks. Communication that had relied on torturous process of astropathic transmission was now instantaneous across distances that would have been unimaginable before. Worlds that had been dependent on Terra for survival now flourished with self-sufficiency, and through it all, I served as his voice, his representative to those who could not endure his direct presence. I traveled to worlds across the galaxy, bearing his message of transformation, witnessing dismantling of the old order and painful birth of the new. Some received this message with joy, recognizing in it fulfillment of prophecies they'd never truly understood. Others resisted, clinging to familiar corruptions of the old Imperium, preferring the devil they knew to uncertain future the Emperor offered. The Space Marines, those who'd survived his initial judgment, were divided. Some chapters embraced return of their gene father, accepting with humility the corrections he offered to flaws that had developed in their practices over millennia. Others rebelled, unable to reconcile his new vision with traditions they'd maintained for 10,000 years. These were dealt with, not through destruction, but through separation, contained within regions of space where they could maintain their ways without interfering with broader transformation of humanity. The imperial cult, that vast edifice of faith built around worship of the Emperor as a That was the most difficult institution to dismantle. For billions upon billions of humans, faith in the God Emperor had been the only constant in lives filled with suffering and fear. To suddenly be told this faith was misplaced, that the being they'd worshipped rejected their devotion, it was a psychological blow many could not withstand. Here the Emperor showed mercy I had not expected, rather than simply erasing faith that had sustained humanity for millennia. He allowed it to be gradually transformed. Rituals remained, but their meaning changed. Prayers once directed to him now became meditations on human potential. Churches once dedicated to his worship became centers for learning, for community, for nurturing of psychic gifts that were becoming more common as his presence in the warp stabilized the immaterium. And throughout all of this, enemies of mankind were not idle. Forces of chaos, though driven back by his initial awakening, regrouped in depths of the warp. Their gods weakened but not destroyed. Alien empires that had preyed upon human worlds watched with mixture of fear and opportunism as the Imperium transformed. Some seeking alliance with the new order, others preparing for war against a distracted foe. I stood now on bridge of a ship unlike any that had existed before. A vessel that traveled not through the warp, but through folds in real space itself. Technology recovered from the dark age of technology and enhanced by the Emperor's own understanding of the universe. Through the view screen, I could see a world that had once been a battleground between forces of the Imperium and Tyrannid hive fleet behemoth. A world stripped of all life, left as a barren rock in the void. The Emperor stood beside me, his form still radiant but now contained, focused, the raw power of his awakening channeled into specific purpose. Around us, a team of former tech priests, now freed from religious dogma that had constrained their innovation, monitored systems beyond my comprehension. This world will live again. Malkador, he said, voice carrying that familiar mixture of authority and vision that had once united humanity. Watch. He extended his hand toward the view screen. I felt a surge of power unlike anything I'd experienced since his awakening. The barren world seemed to shimmer as if viewed through heat haze. And then impossibly I saw green spreading across its surface, oceans forming where there had been only dust. Life returning to a world that had been dead for centuries. This is but the first. One world among millions that will be reborn. The Imperium consumed its worlds, Malkador, stripped them of resources, poisoned them with industry, sacrificed them for strategic advantage. That ends now. Humanity will learn to nurture the worlds it inhabits, to live in balance with the universe rather than in constant war against it. I watched in awe as the world continued to transform, life spreading across its surface at accelerated rate, guided by technologies and powers I could barely comprehend. This was not the Emperor I had known from histories, the conqueror who'd united Terra through war before launching his crusade to reclaim the stars. This was something both more and less than that being, more in power, in vision, in scope of his ambition, less in the human fallibility, the compromises, the expediency that had characterized his earlier reign. What of our enemies, my lord? I asked. The forces of chaos have not been destroyed. The Tyrannids continue to approach from the intergalactic void. The Necrons awaken on tomb worlds throughout the galaxy. Even as we rebuild, they prepare to tear down what we create. He turned to me, expression thoughtful, eyes containing depths that seemed to extend to the beginning of time itself. The greatest enemy humanity has ever faced was itself, Malkador, its own fear, its own ignorance, its own willingness to sacrifice freedom for security, truth for comfort. Address those flaws and the external enemies become manageable. He gestured again. The view screen shifted, showing me visions of conflicts throughout the galaxy. Space Marines fighting alongside Eldari against demons of the warp. Human colonists sharing worlds with Tau. Each race maintaining its culture while benefiting from cooperation. Even more surprising, Necron lords entering into agreements with human leaders. Ancient enemies finding common ground in face of greater threats. Not all Xenos are enemies to be exterminated, Malkador. Some are potential allies. Others are simply different forms of life with their own right to existence. The future I envision includes a humanity secure enough in its own identity to coexist with those who are different, rather than fearing and destroying them reflexively. This was heresy by standards of the Imperium I had known, the xenophobia that had defined human interaction with alien species for millennia was deeply ingrained, reinforced by genuine threats and traumatic encounters. Yet I could not deny logic of his words. In a galaxy filled with threats from within and without, allies of any species were valuable. And what of the greater threat, I asked? The reason you created the Imperium in the first place, the psychic awakening of humanity, the vulnerability to chaos that comes with it. His expression grew more serious, light from his form intensifying slightly. That threat remains, and it is graver than ever. Humanity stands at the threshold of its psychic evolution. The number of human psychers born increases with each generation. Without guidance, without protection, they remain vulnerable to predations of the warp. The entities you know as the Chaos Gods would use them as gateways into real space, as they have done countless times before. He turned fully to me now, his presence filling my consciousness. This is why I cannot simply withdraw, Malcador. This is why the Imperium, even in its corrupted form, was necessary. Humanity needs protection during this vulnerable phase of its development. It needs a shepherd to guide it through the treacherous path of psychic evolution. It needs me. The humility in those last words surprised me. For all his power, for all the changes he'd wrought across the galaxy, he recognized limits of what even he could accomplish. Humanity's path forward was not assured. The threats were real. The dangers immense, even with his direct intervention. Success was not guaranteed, and that, I realized, was the true difference between the being before me and the god that humanity had worshipped for 10,000 years. The god emperor of the imperial cult was infallible, omnipotent, the answer to every question and solution to every problem. The actual emperor was something far more complex, a being of immense power and knowledge. Yes, but one who recognized challenges ahead, who understood that the future was not predetermined, who knew that even he could fail if the choices made were wrong. I will continue to serve, my lord, I said, feeling weight of that commitment anew, for as long as I am needed. For as long as humanity requires guidance through what is to come. He placed his hand on my shoulder, the touch sending currents of energy through my body, rejuvenating me in ways I had not known were possible. Your service has only just begun, Malcador. The transformation of the Imperium, the rebirth of worlds, the reshaping of humanity's relationship with the galaxy. These are but the first steps on a journey that will span millennia. There will be setbacks. There will be failures. There will be moments when all we have built seems on the verge of collapse. His gaze intensified, looking not at me but through me, to futures I could not perceive. But there will also be triumphs beyond imagining, discoveries that redefine what it means to be human, achievements that transcend the limitations of flesh and time, a humanity freed from shackles of fear and ignorance, ready at last to claim its rightful place in the cosmos. He turned back to the view screen, to the reborn world now teeming with life where once there had been only death. That is what happens when the Emperor wakes. Malcador, not the end of all things as you once feared, but the beginning of what should always have been. I stood beside him, watching as the future unfolded, one world at a time. And I knew that though the path ahead would be difficult, though challenges would seem insurmountable at times, the journey had begun. The true Imperium, the one he had always intended, was taking its first faltering steps. Epilogue. The endless vigil, what happens when the Emperor wakes? Everything changes. Nothing is certain. The future lies unwritten. But for the first time in 10,000 years, there is genuine hope for mankind. Not the false hope of salvation through faith, not the desperate hope of survival against impossible odds, but the real hope of becoming something more than what we have been, of fulfilling the potential that has always existed within humanity, of creating a future worthy of the sacrifices that have sustained us through our long night. The Emperor is awake, the transformation has begun, and I, Malcador Vane, last faithful son who dared to question a god, will bear witness to whatever comes. The galaxy will never be the same. The age of blind faith is ending. The age of awakening has begun, and whether that awakening leads us to transcendence or oblivion, only time will tell, but we will face it together, God and man, side by side as it was always meant to be. The vigil continues, but now we stand watch over humanity's future, not its past.